William didn't argue with his father. He stopped him. Right there, in the room, with a document already waiting for King Charles to sign. And what Charles was about to hand over to Camilla could have created a royal problem far bigger than anyone expected. For weeks, the plan had apparently been moving forward quietly. King Charles had chosen the residence, approved the arrangement, and was preparing to make the transfer official. On paper, everything looked settled. Camilla had already been thinking about staff, renovations, security, and how the household would run. She had every reason to believe the decision was basically finished. Then William walked in. What happened next was not a polite disagreement between a father and his son. According to the story, William stepped forward and stopped the authorization before Charles could sign it. There was no long argument. No shouting. No dramatic speech. Just one firm message: a crown residence should not be permanently handed over without a formal review and vote. That single statement changed the entire situation. Charles reportedly stared at the document, then looked at William. The king had expected questions and perhaps some resistance, but he apparently never expected his own son to challenge the decision at that exact moment. William was no longer simply expressing an opinion. He was drawing a line around what he believed should remain under crown control. And Camilla reportedly knew nothing about the confrontation until an aide reached her in the corridor. She had already been planning for the move. Then came the message: William had blocked the transfer. She reportedly stopped, dismissed the aide, walked into a private room, and closed the door. For her, the embarrassment may have come before the anger. But William had not walked into that room empty-handed. He reportedly brought a constitutional briefing outlining concerns over the legal and financial side of the arrangement. The issue was bigger than one house. Security, maintenance, ceremonial duties, and public funding could all remain connected to the crown. That meant the decision could affect future monarchs as well. And suddenly, what looked like a simple family decision had become something much more serious. Because William wasn't just saying no. He was asking a much bigger question. Who has the right to decide what belongs to the crown, and what happens when the future king refuses to let that decision happen in silence? This was never just about who would live in a certain house. The real question was much bigger. Who would have to deal with the consequences of that decision years, or even decades, later? Once William stepped in, staying quiet was no longer possible. And what made the situation even more shocking was who had been left out of the conversation. Princess and had not been informed. Several senior members of the family, whose support could eventually matter, were also reportedly unaware of what was being planned. Only a small group had seen the authorization. To William, that secrecy was a serious warning. If the arrangement was completely reasonable, why had so few people been allowed to question it? That was the part he could not ignore. But the property itself was only the beginning. William believed his late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had made a specific promise connected to the residence, and he was prepared to bring those words into the conversation. Yet before he could do that, he had to understand something much more painful. Why did his father feel so strongly about giving the home to Camilla? Behind the doors, the argument was really about three very different futures. Charles saw the residence as a powerful statement that his wife had finally been accepted into the heart of the monarchy. He wanted Camilla to feel secure, respected, and permanent. To him, this was not simply about giving her a beautiful home. It was about proving that she belonged. Camilla saw something different. For her, the residence could represent protection. She knew that one day Charles would no longer be there to defend her, and she wanted a place that could give her security when that day came. William saw the same building in an entirely different way. He believed crown property was held for the institution, not given away as a personal gift. In his eyes, the residence belonged to something larger than any marriage or family promise. That difference created a painful divide. Charles felt that William was placing rules above his father's wishes. William feared that his father was allowing personal feelings to influence decisions that could affect future generations. Neither man believed he was hurting the other. And yet, both walked away feeling betrayed. Charles saw a son rejecting an important promise. William saw a father crossing a boundary he believed had to remain in place. This was no longer simply a disagreement between a king and his heir. It had become a battle between family loyalty and royal duty, and neither side was willing to step back. This was where the real clash began. Camilla was sitting alone with a floor plan spread across the table. Several rooms had already been marked out, and she studied every detail as if she were trying to picture her future there. Then she quietly folded the papers, placed them back inside the folder, and closed it. Her anger was real, but underneath that anger was something much deeper: fear. William's intervention had forced her to face a possibility she had tried not to think about. Her security might depend entirely on how long Charles remained strong enough to protect her. That is why the residence meant far more to Camilla than comfort or status. It represented safety. It represented the promise that she would still have a secure place within the royal family even when circumstances changed. Catherine had understood that risk before William ever confronted his father. During a private conversation, William admitted that challenging Charles could create a wound between them that might never completely heal. Catherine did not tell him what decision to make. Instead, she gave him one warning that stayed in his mind: once the papers were signed, remaining silent could make him part of a decision he believed was wrong. Those words changed how William looked at the situation. He was no longer asking himself whether he wanted a confrontation. He was asking whether doing nothing would make him responsible for the outcome. Months earlier, Charles had made Camilla a deeply personal promise. She had reportedly opened up about her fear of losing her secure position if Charles were ever unable to protect her. He reassured her that she would always have a home and a place within the institution he led. The proposed transfer was his way of keeping that promise. But Anne believed there was another side to the story. She remembered a private conversation connected to the late Queen Elizabeth II. Years earlier, after a tense family dinner at Windsor, the Queen had asked Anne to stay behind. There were no advisors in the room and no public announcement afterward. But before Anne left, her mother made one point completely clear: official royal residences should never become personal rewards. The distinction was crucial. A private family property could be inherited, gifted, or placed into a trust. An official residence was different. It existed to support the monarch's duties, and its staff, security, maintenance, and ceremonial role could continue across generations. The Queen feared that once those boundaries became blurred, personal promises could slowly turn into permanent obligations for the crown. Anne listened carefully and said nothing. Her mother was not attacking Camilla. She was protecting the future. And years later, those quiet words were suddenly at the center of the biggest family dispute yet. The late Queen wanted Anne to remember one simple rule: being generous with someone does not mean giving them ownership. And understood that her mother was not making casual conversation. She was preparing her daughter for a problem that might one day become impossible to ignore. And years later, that exact situation appeared. During a dinner at Windsor Castle, Camilla had spoken about creating a permanent household inside the Queen's official residence. Charles answered quickly. He told her that once the authority belonged to him, he would make sure she had that security. The late Queen heard every word. She quietly placed her glass on the table, looked at her son, and ended the conversation before anyone could turn the moment into something softer. Later that evening, she explained her concern to Anne in private. Her objection was not based on personal dislike toward Camilla. It was about what could happen to the monarchy if private emotions started influencing crown property. If royal homes were used to heal personal pain or fulfill private promises, future monarchs could be left paying for those decisions through public funds, staff, security, and long-term commitments. The Queen decided to put her concern in writing. She dictated a short memorandum for the official records and then added a handwritten sentence herself. No permanent reassignment of the residence, she wrote, should happen without proper consultation and recorded approval. That sentence changed everything. It did not completely ban a future transfer. Instead, it demanded that such a major decision could not happen secretly or through one person's private choice. And kept a certified copy. She never needed to use it while her mother was alive because the situation never reached that point. Charles had received a general reminder that the property needed to remain available for official duties, but he had apparently never been shown the full warning about permanently assigning it to a royal consort. Now the document was back in the center of the dispute, and showed it to William and explained exactly where it came from. William read the handwritten sentence twice. Then he closed the folder and decided he would speak to his father himself. When he entered Charles's private office, the authorization was still unsigned. William placed the Queen's memorandum beside it. What followed was not a formal lecture. It was a deeply personal confrontation between a father trying to protect his wife and a son worried about the consequences that could follow them into the future. William told Charles that the residence belonged to the crown, not to one marriage. Its staff, security, maintenance, and official duties were connected to the monarchy itself. Charles disagreed. He argued that the king had authority over royal households and that giving Camilla permanent use would not remove the property from the crown. To him, it was about stability and protecting his wife. William saw something else, a precedent that future monarchs might struggle to undo. He pushed the unsigned papers back across the desk. "You cannot give away what you hold in trust." Charles's expression changed. He accused William of turning family loyalty into disobedience. William answered firmly, loyalty did not mean staying silent. And then, before either man could say another word, Camilla walked into the room. Camilla had just discovered that a major decision about her future had been discussed behind a closed door, and she was not willing to stand outside that room any longer. She looked directly at William and asked a painful question. After years of serving beside Charles, did he really believe she had earned nothing? William knew his answer could hurt her, so he spoke carefully. He explained that her years of service deserved respect, security, and dignity. But in his view, service could not turn an official royal residence into someone's personal property. Camilla understood the words, but they still felt like a rejection. To her, William was not simply protecting a rule. He was reminding her that no matter how much she had done for the monarchy, there were still limits to how completely she would be accepted. Then William turned the old memorandum toward Charles. The king immediately recognized his mother's handwriting. He did not even need to finish reading the page before the weight of it became clear. Charles slowly sat down, visibly shaken by the realization that the late queen had predicted a situation almost exactly like this. The document required consultation before any permanent change could be made. And Charles knew who had kept it. His anger quickly turned toward his sister. He felt that she had known about the warning while his plans moved forward and had chosen not to tell him. To Charles, that silence felt like a personal betrayal. But despite his anger, he did not simply cancel the proposal. Instead, he left the authorization unsigned and ordered the matter to be taken before the Royal Estates Council, the body responsible for major decisions involving official royal property. The private confrontation was over. Now the entire issue was moving into the open. When the proposal reached the council chamber, everything suddenly became formal. Documents were numbered. Seats were filled. Every statement had to follow procedure. Yet underneath all that careful language was one uncomfortable question. Could a king use royal authority to keep a personal promise to his wife? Charles believed his position would carry enormous weight. William believed the late queen's written instruction mattered more. Camilla understood that the decision could determine far more than where she would live. It could decide how secure her position would be in the years ahead. Charles opened the meeting calmly. He reminded everyone that the monarch had the right to propose arrangements involving royal residences. But the council quickly pointed out that permanent control was different. The property required security, staff, maintenance, and public resources. Those responsibilities would continue long after Charles was gone. The room began to divide. Some officials supported a renewable arrangement that would allow Camilla to remain there while Charles was king. William and opposed any wording that could later be interpreted as permanent personal ownership. Edward tried to find a compromise that would protect Camilla's dignity without weakening the rules surrounding crown property. Charles listened as one objection followed another. Everyone spoke respectfully. But respect was not the same as agreement. The king slowly tapped his finger against the table. Then he noticed William watching him. His hand stopped. William said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence carried the weight of everything that had already happened between father and son. And opened the late queen's memorandum and began reading. Her voice stayed steady as she moved through the formal language, but everyone in the room could feel the tension building. Then she reached the final handwritten sentence. And stopped for a moment, took a breath, and continued. The message was clear. No permanent change to the residence should happen without proper consultation and recorded approval. Reading those words in front of her brother was not easy. and knew that honoring her mother's wishes meant standing against Charles, and she could feel the weight of that choice. Then another detail came to light, and this one made the room even quieter. A financial clause showed that the proposed arrangement could have placed long-term renovation, staffing, security, and maintenance costs on crown funds, even if Camilla eventually stopped carrying out official duties. Suddenly, this was no longer simply a question of who would live inside a royal residence. It was about who might still be responsible for the costs years after the original decision had been forgotten. In other words, the person holding the keys could change, but the bill could continue for generations. William finally offered a compromise. He said Camilla should have full use of the residence while Charles remained king. She would receive protection, staff, household support, and every level of dignity expected from the queen consort. But when Charles's reign ended, the property would automatically return to unrestricted crown use. William stressed that he was not trying to remove Camilla or embarrass her. He wanted to prevent a private promise from becoming a permanent arrangement that future monarchs would be forced to carry. The council remained divided. Charles could not simply order the transfer through, but he still had choices. He could withdraw the proposal, change its terms, or continue defending it until the final decision. The room fell silent as he reached for the original papers. He had entered the meeting determined to keep a promise he had made to his wife. Now that same promise had placed him in an impossible position. He had to decide whether protecting Camilla meant weakening the boundary he would eventually leave to William. The news reached Camilla before the official statement was ready. She would be allowed to live in the residence and use it fully while Charles remained sovereign. But it would not become her permanent property. There would be no guaranteed claim beyond his reign, and the arrangement would not automatically continue under the next monarch. On paper, the difference sounded technical. To Camilla, it felt deeply personal. She could live there, but she could never truly call it hers. Charles eventually accepted William's revised arrangement and withdrew the original proposal. Camilla would have the security, household staff, and protection she needed during Charles's reign, while control of the residence would remain with the crown. A promise that had once sounded permanent had now become temporary, and that change hurt more than any public announcement could explain. The effects were immediate. Renovation plans involving permanent changes were paused. Staffing arrangements were reviewed. Documents describing the residence as Camilla's future private home were pulled back and rewritten. Each correction removed another sign that the original plan had ever been certain. Later, Camilla sat alone with the unused keys on the table in front of her. She did not throw them away. She did not call for an aid. She simply waited. When Charles entered the room, she looked at him and asked one question. "Did you ever really have the power to promise it?" Charles did not answer right away. That silence said more than an argument could have. Eventually, he admitted that he had made the promise because he wanted to erase years of doubt and rejection. He believed giving Camilla a permanent home would finally prove that nobody could push her aside again. Camilla listened quietly. Then she told him that a promise made without the power to keep it had given her comfort at first, but ended by making her feel humiliated. William soon learned how deeply Camilla had taken the decision. A private palace briefing informed him that she believed he had used procedure to remind everyone that her place in the monarchy was still conditional. That accusation unsettled him. William had believed he was protecting the institution. But now he was beginning to understand that winning the argument on paper did not mean there had been no emotional cost. Catherine tried to prevent the wound from becoming permanent. In a private message, she explained that the vote had never been designed to push Camilla away from royal life. She acknowledged how painful it could be to live inside a system where homes, titles, and privileges could all come with limits. Camilla read the message twice. She did not respond. Instead, she asked William for a private meeting. No Charles. No advisors. No prepared speeches. The council had settled the property dispute, but the family's real problem remained unresolved. When William entered the private room, he expected anger. Instead, he found Camilla standing quietly beside the cold fireplace. She looked at him and asked something far more difficult than whether he regretted the vote. She asked whether he had ever truly wanted her to feel secure within the monarchy. William knew that his answer could determine what happened next. Because this was no longer only about a residence. It was about whether a family could survive after loyalty, duty, love, and power had all collided in the same room. Camilla listened to him carefully, then made one condition before they continued. She wanted William to tell her the truth, without hiding behind the crown. Nothing said in that room would be passed through secretaries, lawyers, or carefully written palace statements. William agreed. For the first time since the dispute began, he and Camilla could speak honestly, without hiding behind royal titles or official language. William explained that he had never wanted to take away her dignity. His concern was what would happen if crown property were used to settle a private promise. The next monarch, he said, would inherit more than the cost of maintaining the residence. He would inherit an obligation created by someone else. Future kings could be expected to defend a promise they had never made, using resources that were meant to serve the crown rather than one family relationship. Camilla listened quietly. Then she finally admitted what she had been afraid to say. Charles's declining strength and William's growing role had made the future feel uncertain. She did not know where she would stand once Charles was no longer king. She worried that her security could depend on people who might never fully accept her. The residence had become important because, in her mind, it offered protection from that fear. It was not simply a beautiful home. It was proof that she would still have a secure place when the person protecting her was no longer there. William did not dismiss her feelings. Instead, he admitted something of his own. He had spent so much time thinking about rules, finances, inheritance, and the future of the monarchy that he had sometimes forgotten the human being standing in front of him. He understood that living beside a crown could be confusing. One day, the institution could make someone feel completely accepted. The next day, the same system could remind them that nothing was guaranteed. William could not give Camilla permanent control of an official residence. But he could help make sure her future did not depend on personal affection or changing family relationships. Then he offered another solution. He would support a privately funded lifetime residence for Camilla, paid for through private royal resources rather than crown property. She could have security, independence, and a permanent place to live without turning an official royal home into a personal possession. Camilla was silent for several seconds. Then she admitted the truth. She had never needed that particular residence as much as she needed reassurance that she would not simply be pushed aside when Charles was gone. Once William understood that, the entire argument looked different. Camilla agreed to support the council's decision and allow a formal statement to be released. Her acceptance removed the possibility of another round of fighting. William returned to Charles with a solution rather than a victory. When he told his father that Camilla had accepted the arrangement, Charles finally understood what had gone wrong. William had never been trying to punish him or humiliate his wife. The real problem had been the promise Charles had made while trying to protect someone he loved. By the next morning, the private dispute was no longer private. News organizations quickly picked up the story. Newspapers changed their planned coverage, television programs interrupted regular schedules, and crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Some people believed William had embarrassed his father and undermined Camilla. Others praised him for showing that the future king was willing to place royal rules above family pressure. One unsigned document had suddenly become a national argument about the monarchy itself. What did the crown actually own? What did it merely manage? And who should those decisions ultimately serve? The palace eventually released a formal statement. Camilla would retain full use of the residence while Charles remained sovereign, but the property itself would stay permanently connected to the crown. Any future change would require proper consultation and approval. The statement was carefully written, but it did little to end the debate. Commentators immediately divided into two camps. Some called William disrespectful for challenging a reigning king. Others said he had done exactly what a responsible future monarch should do. To one side, it looked like disobedience. To the other, it looked like preparation for the future. Charles saw the headlines himself the following morning. He unfolded the newspaper during breakfast and found the story on the front page. The headline described William's intervention as a major royal challenge. Charles quietly folded the paper before Camilla could see it. But she had already read it. Neither of them spoke. William also faced the public reaction. As he left an official engagement, one person thanked him for protecting the crown. Another accused him of humiliating his own father. William stopped briefly, but said nothing. He understood that there was no perfect outcome. Whatever he had done, people would judge it according to their own loyalties. Then Camilla made the decision that surprised many observers. She addressed the public herself. In a recorded message, the Queen Consort said she accepted the Council's decision and supported keeping the residence available for future sovereigns. Her words removed much of the tension surrounding the dispute. Instead of allowing the disagreement to become an open battle between royal factions, she chose to support the final arrangement. Charles responded by asking both Camilla and William to join him at the next official engagement. The appearance could not erase everything that had happened, but it would show whether the family could stand together after the argument had stripped away every excuse. When Charles entered the reception, Camilla walked beside him. William followed a step behind. Then something unexpected happened. Charles stopped. He turned toward his son and invited him forward. It was a small gesture, but everyone watching understood what it meant. William had challenged his father's decision, but he had never tried to replace him. He had questioned the decision because he believed the crown itself needed protection. Charles understood that. The final agreement was then recorded. The residence would remain crown property. It could be assigned for royal use, but it could not be permanently transferred because of one personal promise. Any future change would require consultation and a documented decision. Camilla's long-term security would come through a separate private housing arrangement. She would have dignity, independence, and protection without placing a permanent burden on the official royal estate. Before the engagement, Charles apologized to her privately. He admitted that he had confused ownership with security. He had wanted to prove that she belonged, but in doing so, he had promised something he could not permanently control. Camilla did not respond with anger. Instead, she told him that honesty had finally given her something the residents never could, certainty without false promises. William then spoke privately with his father. Charles admitted that being stopped by his own son had felt like a painful loss of authority. William answered that staying silent would have created a much bigger problem later. Charles did not celebrate the answer, but he accepted it. William also refused to call the outcome his victory. He asked the palace not to describe it that way. The decision, he said, belonged to the council, the late Queen's written instruction, and Camilla's own acceptance. Days later, Camilla entered the residence again. Not as its owner, as the Queen entrusted with its care. She cancelled the plans for permanent personal changes and instead asked that one room preserve the history of the royal women who had lived there before her. In the end, everyone gave something. Charles protected his wife. William protected the crown. Camilla secured her future without claiming what belonged to future monarchs. And a private promise was stopped before it could become a permanent royal obligation. The family was left wounded, but not broken. The monarchy had been tested, and it survived because one future king was willing to place his hand over a document and ask the question that nobody else wanted to ask. Had anyone actually stopped to make sure this was right?